webinar from Faunalytics about the intersection of conservative values and animal advocacy. This webinar will have 3 parts. In the first section, I will be explaining the main findings and results from our most recent study on conservative values and animal advocacy. In our second part, I will be moderating a small panel with our 2 guests, Roland Halpern and Max Broad. And then the final section, the audience, you will all have a chance to ask questions to these 2 amazing guests that we have here today, whatever you are wondering or whatever you are curious about. So if at any point during today's presentation, you are free to put a question into the chat, and we will be able to ask it at the end, or you could unmute yourself at the end and ask a question. So with that, I will begin a small summary of this study that we have released. I won't be able to cover every single thing that we uncovered in this study. It is rather long, but I'll do my best to cover the main points and the main things that we uncovered. So let's jump in. In this study, we analyzed 4 different sources of conservative values. We wanted to analyze what are the values that conservatives in the US hold, and in what ways do they intersect with the values of the animal advocacy movement. We started this study because previous research has indicated that conservatives are less likely to undertake most pro-animal actions, including a vegan or vegetarian diet, voting for pro-animal candidates, and similar things like that, signing a petition, donating to animal causes, et cetera, et cetera. However, we wanted to uncover, if this is the case, how can we still advance animal welfare in areas that are more conservative or with people who happen to be conservative? What progress is there to be made here? And that's where the study steps in. So the 4 places that we took conservative values of in our analysis are, number 1, official sources. This includes the Republican Party platform, the Republican website, things like that, the official party guidelines. The second one was public sources. So this is things like Gallup polls, surveys, opinion polling of conservative, and similar things like that. The third is demonstrated sources. So this is how lawmakers actually acted, how they voted, how they supported various pro-animal bills or anti-animal bills, like the EATS Act, for example. And basically ways that they upheld pro-animal values, or may have not done so. And the fourth one is rhetorical sources. So these are things in the media, values demonstrated in the communication space. I think we all know examples of this: Fox News, American Conservative, National Review, et cetera, et cetera. So we took these 4 sources of values, official, demonstrated, public, and rhetorical, and we basically coded, which is a researchy way of saying we analyzed and broke it down into categories, 71 values that are commonly held by conservatives. We then grouped these 71 values into 8 different categories. Of these 71 values, I know it's a lot of numbers, we'll get past it in a moment. Of these 71 values, 22 of them were identified by us as potential inroads for animal advocates. And these values are the ones that I believe animal advocates should take the most seriously. We can get into a couple of examples. Here are the first set of values. The ones in green are ones that are potential inroads. In red are potential barriers. If they are not colored, then they tend to not have much overlap with animal advocacy. Like I mentioned, we don't have time to get into every single value today, but there are a couple of highlights: family and community, health, honesty, justice, for example, freedom of speech, responsible use of power, responsible spending. These are all values that are held by conservatives that overlap with the goals of animal advocacy in some way or another. I'll get to specific examples in 1 or 2 slides. And at the top here, maybe I should mention this first, these words, personal, social, constitutional, economic, are the category of values. So these are personal values, social values, constitutional values, and economic values. These are the first 4 categories. If you want to read the entire study and go into every one in detail, I believe Jenna has put the link into the group chat and you can review them there. I am going to go on from now to the next slide, where we see the other 4 categories: national security, religious, nationalism, and I guess miscellaneous, ones that didn't quite fit into another one. So we can see here, like, respect the law, faith, loyalty to Donald Trump, animal welfare, stand against crime, or stand against enemy states are conservative values that in some way could overlap with animal advocacy. So I know this is a very theoretical report. It's all about values. It's all about ways that people think about things. But we did come up with a list of examples of issues that we believe fall into these values. So this comes from an infographic in the study itself. In the blue column are ways that Republican or conservative legislators can enact pro-animal values. And in the green are ways that the conservative public could potentially enact pro-animal values. So we can see here at the top, for example, honesty, a Republican lawmaker could ban ag-gag bills, which are bills that prevent or limit the free speech of animal rights activists. However, a conservative public could support country of origin labeling laws, stand against humane washing, support whistleblower laws, and things like that. This is not intended to be an entirely exhaustive list. These are just some examples of the ways we think these values could be practiced by animal advocates. Another example could be reason right here. The value of reason could be essentially leveraged to ban animal testing, for example, due to the ineffectiveness of many animal testing practices as compared to alternatives. So this is all about the way that these initiatives, bills, campaigns are framed, right? If the ultimate goal is to ban animal testing, these are the values that we believe are the best ways to frame it if you're engaging with the conservative individuals or the conservative movement more broadly. Again, we're not going to be able to go, we don't have time to go through every single one, but I'll just show some more examples here from the social and economic values. For example, conventionalism. Conventionalism could be a value that could leverage against factory farming and support family-owned farms or other higher welfare versions of animal farming, or against factory farming in general. Economic prosperity, depending on the alternative protein, you could support alternative protein as a way to boost the economy in some ways, for example. And then the final list, we have, for example, freedom of speech. We have ag-gag laws again, fights against alternative protein labeling laws, standing against the meat corporations silencing small farms and animal advocates, et cetera, et cetera. Lastly, I wanted to highlight another resource that I developed in regards to this study, which is a small list of the polls that we reviewed that indicated some pro-animal positions that are held by the majority of conservative public in the United States. Like we mentioned earlier, some research has found that they don't tend to support pro-animal beliefs. However, there are some that are commonly supported. They find keeping chickens in tiny cages unacceptable. They would support a ban on farmed animal confinement. They believe castrating pigs without anesthesia is unacceptable, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe this list could indicate some key ways animal advocates can work with conservatives or in conservative areas to promote some aspects of animal welfare. Finally, I wanted to plug, if you have questions about the research, at Faunalytics, we are always able to answer your questions. You can talk to the researchers who worked on this study, which include myself. You could talk about how to apply this to your work, or anything else that you're curious about in regards to political or legislative research. So that is a short review and a short overview of the study. But what we're most interested in doing today is applying this study to actual activists who are working in the political and legislative realms. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two guests here today. So first we have Roland Halpern. Roland Halpern is the Executive Director of Colorado Voters for Animals, an all-volunteer, nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is to identify and help elect animal-friendly candidates and then work with them to pass sensible animal welfare protection laws. He has over 20 years experience working both sides of the aisle, trying to find common ground that will advance animal welfare laws in Colorado. Roland holds a master's in nonprofit management from Regis University, is an ordained animal chaplain through the Emerson Theological Institute, is a board member of the Unitarian Universalist Animal Ministry, and also serves on the board of Metro Denver Crime Stoppers, where he helps evaluate and recommend rewards for tips resulting in arrests on animal cruelty cases. Thank you so much for being with us today, Roland.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. And our second guest is Max Broad. Max Broad founded DC Voters for Animals in 2019 to lift up the policies and politicians doing the most for animals in our community in the nation's capital. As a longtime climate advocate, Max saw how influential a small group of passionate citizens can be in the policy process. With a master's in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara, Max has worked at the National Wildlife Federation as a contractor at the U.S. Department of Energy and AmeriCorps NCCC. Max is also an avid Civil War history buff, mushroom hunter, and a meditation enthusiast. Thank you for joining us, Max.
Glad to be here.
Okay, finally, before we jump into the questions, I just do have one note about how we would like to approach today's conversation. I'd like to clarify the purpose of the webinar and the study itself. The study was conducted to assess conservative values and is in no way an endorsement of any political ideology or any political candidate. Faunalytics does not endorse politicians. And in today's webinar, we are interested in having a productive conversation about the application of the study's findings. This is not a venue to discuss the 2024 US election, individuals' political affiliations, or ideology outside of their application to animal activism. And finally, I hope this goes without saying, but please keep your questions and remarks, both oral and written, civil and respectful. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a very good conversation. Okay, so let's jump into the findings from the study. Roland and Max, whoever wants to take this one first. What was most surprising about this study? Did anything stand out to you in particular?
Well, I'll jump in first, Max. Not a lot of surprises because I've been doing this for 20 years, and when I don't have a surprise, it reinforces the fact I'm doing my job and I'm keeping on top of things. But one thing that was interesting is we had 71 conservative values, if you will. Only 22 of those possibly overlapped with what we're doing, and some of those 22 were kind of weak at that. So that was a little bit disappointing. I mean, anecdotally, I expected that, but it just shows the divide. And I don't want to get off too much on tangent, but real quickly, there's this thing about red brain, green brain, where they've done these studies where they put conservatives and liberals into MRIs and they ask the same questions or show the same pictures, and different areas of the brain will light up if a person is a conservative versus a liberal. And they've actually been able to predict with, I think it's like 80 some odd percent certainty, they can just look at the results and tell whether the persons are liberal or conservative without even knowing the person, just based on that. And with the conservatives, the portion of the brain that lights up has to do with fear, which I think is very telling. And with the liberals, it tends to be the more open people that are interested in exploring things, working out solutions and whatever. So I'm kind of getting off track here, but I just want to put that into the equation because sometimes people are hardwired and we have to accept that and deal with it. So sorry to be so long.
No, this is good. I like this idea. I did read some research that conservatives do tend to be motivated by fear. And some of the values that we identified are related to that in some way. For example, there are some advocates who are promoting alternative proteins in the United States, not for the sake of alternative proteins, but essentially to beat the competitors to the United States, quote unquote, enemy states. For example, a narrative device, how the US is falling behind the technological progress of China or Europe, for example, with alternative proteins. And I think that kind of gets at what you're talking at here, this idea of fear as opposed to exploration of curiosity. Do you think there's other ways that fear is able to be used, like this idea can be used?
Well, if you know what the fears are, there's possible ways to address them, and some of it has to do with language. And the way you say things, like we talk about prohibitions rather than ban, because ban tends to have, it resonates with some people as like a bad thing. So instead of talking about banning something, we'll talk about a prohibition against it or use some other language. And there's certain terms, and this will vary by state, but we have terms that we use and terms that we lose to kind of not immediately set up roadblocks to people. One thing too, and I'm going to get off on another tangent, when you look at pet ownership, conservatives tend to want purebred animals versus the liberals tend to do shelter animals, rescues, and whatever. And again, and I don't want to read too much into this, but if you look at immigration, for instance, the purebred versus the Heinz 57 variety, I just kind of found that very interesting. So that probably didn't answer the question, but I don't want to, take up too much time because I know Max wants to say something.
Yeah, very interesting. We identify purity as a value that could be leveraged against animal advocacy as well. So I definitely hear where you're coming from. Max, I want to hear your thoughts. Like, what was surprising about these values? What stood out to you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and really thanks for doing this research, Faunalytics, because obviously the timing is very relevant. We have a big election coming up very soon. Things are going to change, right? We don't know exactly how things are going to change, but things are going to change one way or another. And that's the point of this research, is that we can't always count on one party to be in power all the time. And so the way I like to look at this research and thinking like this is that when you're talking to somebody with a different value frame than your own, it's like talking in a different language, right? So if I approach a conservative lawmaker and I approach them with a liberal value frame, if I pitch them or lobby them in a way that's using liberal values and liberal ideas, it's going to be like speaking to them in a different language. And so this research really helps us get to think from the frame of a conservative decision maker and put our goals into that conservative frame, which I really, really love. But the other thing this research does is it prompts us as a movement to think about our approach, right? Our theory of change politically. And there's some people who are going to say, like, hey, I want to work within the tribe and just dive deeper into the left-leaning approach to advocacy. There are people who are going to say, I want to stay totally neutral. But the fact of the matter is that we can't ignore the political nature of this work and just can only outreach altogether, liberals. We need to make sure that we're being really inclusive. I think the animals would count on us to try and reach as many people as possible. And the fact of the matter is that excluding Republicans from the conversation has real world consequences, right? Like what we've seen in Florida is a good example of the culture war on cultured meat. So it's really important that there are folks out there thinking about, what's my approach, that we're being intentional as a movement about who we're approaching and what tribes we're part of. And that everybody here is deciding for themselves, asking themselves that question, what's my best role? And everybody's not going to have the same best role, but it's important for people to have some insight into, how they want to approach what communities they want to outreach. And, the way I like to put it is that the broader our movement, the more resilience we have to political change, to turnover, as we know, administrations can change.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Max said. And the pendulum does swing both ways. And if you're only playing to one side of the aisle and then things change, you're basically dead in the water. And so one of the things we do is we try and build relationships on both sides, because if things do change, we at least want to have friends that we could talk to. So, and I won't go into too much detail on that because we'll probably have other questions that delve into that later.
I think that jumps into one of the most central questions that this type of research brings up, which is which value, either from the study or your past experience, do you think is the best for animal advocates to essentially use in their framing when talking to lawmakers or the public? What value do you like, Max? You were just talking about talking to somebody with a different values, like talking a different language, right? So if somebody were to try to learn this language of another person's values, which of these values do you think we should start with? What are the most ripe for opportunity, in your opinion? Either of you.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that in my work at DC Voters for Animals, I embrace hypocrisy, right? Because all decision makers, we can't expect everybody to be a full animal rights, policymaker, but everybody cares about animals in some regard, right? So it's kind of about finding that foot in the door. And one that I really like that I think resonates with all policymakers, liberal or conservative, is this idea of leadership. And Bjorn, you were just pointing to this, right? You're just talking about how we want, there's an element of the cultured meat world where we want to be the best in the world. We don't want to let any other country overlap us. We don't want to be leapfrogged by any other movement. We want to show USA #1, right? And I think policymakers really resonate with this frame, rather than pointing out what's wrong in the world, pointing out what we could do, what we could accomplish. And so I think harnessing leadership, and you'll notice when policymakers are giving speeches, they will often be pointing to the positives, right? And I think they like to communicate in that type of language. So I think that's a really strong value to start with.
No, and I would agree with that. And one of the things we do is we try and sit down and get to know the people. We don't deal too much at the federal level, because when you look at it, to get something passed through the federal government, over in the House of Representatives, you need like 218 votes. Here in Colorado, it's a lot less because we only have 65 representatives, so we only need half that number. But we like to sit down and talk with people, and we found that over the years, the rhetoric and the vitriol has been decreasing. We still don't agree on a lot of issues, but we've been able to have respectful disagreement. And that's one of the things. And so it softens it. It doesn't necessarily you're going to move somebody from one side to the other, but at least it allows for civil discourse. And I think that's a big part of moving things forward.
That transitions to my next question really nicely, which is I want to hear some stories of your work in the past. How were you able to take a pro-animal issue and essentially work with a conservative or a conservative group to try and get it passed in some way? Can you give some examples from your past work?
Yeah, I can start out, and I don't mean to supersede you here, Max. We worked a number of years ago on a COLA bill, country of origin labeling. It wasn't our bill, but it was introduced by the Republicans, and that would have required that meat that was brought into the state or originated in the state had to be labeled as to its origin. And we felt, even though it involved meat, which as our organization, we're not really into meat eating, we thought it's better if the consumer knows that the animals, if you will, were local or were foreign. The idea being with local animals, at least we have the USDA and we have some standards for treatment of animals, whereas in other countries, they might not have any animal welfare standards at all. So that's when we worked on. We worked on one recently. We were able to pass the Division of Animal Welfare under the Department of Agriculture, making us only the second state to have such a division. And that was something that was done on a bipartisan basis. And part of that was looking at being proactive rather than reactive, because under the previous situation where there wasn't a division, They only went out and they investigated things after they happened. So somebody would call and say, there's this rancher and the cows are like suffering or the horses are suffering. So part of the proaction is to do education and get out and teach people how to prevent those problems from happening. And we had a good deal of support on the conservative side for that. They accepted those values.
Yeah, I'll add that long before I was doing animal advocacy, I was doing climate advocacy, and I was volunteering with a group called Citizens Climate Lobby that does like a lot of bipartisan advocacy on Capitol Hill in the US. And this is something that we really worked hard around. How do we make climate change relevant to people on both sides of the aisle? And it really informs my work today. And so the concept that I want to make sure everybody walks away with here is called values-based listening. Values-based listening, right? So when somebody's talking, you're really listening for not to rebut them and not to refute them, but to hone in on what their values are. And so let me give you an example here. So in DC, our main campaign right now is to pass a bill that would prohibit the sale of new fur in DC. We have an opportunity to become, the next jurisdiction to ban fur, but we haven't done it yet. And the council member who's responsible for moving this bill forward, even though she's a Democrat, has indicated that she's really sensitive to business voices, right? So, that makes it a little harder when the fur industry is pushing back hard against this bill and they're coming out swinging. But rather than go against her values, we're going to go with them, right? So that's where we're putting on a sign-on letter for businesses saying, hey, we believe in a humane economy in DC. And so we're gonna take this as a note from the council member, listen to what her priorities are, and lift up her priorities in our advocacy.
And Max, I'm glad you brought up climate because here in Colorado, we've had a lot of fires that have devastated a lot of wilderness. And that obviously affects animals. So if you get, and lawmakers on both sides are very, very concerned about, that devastation. And so they're working on it. So we can work with them on climate bills that tangentially really protect animals. And so that's one of the ways that sometimes, beneath the surface, we're really working on animal protection issues, but we're getting cooperation on both sides of the aisle to solve a larger problem.
Really great answers. I like this idea of value-based listening. This kind of gets into what we're trying to do at Faunalytics quite a bit. Is like working with instead of working against. We would love to press a button and just make everybody have the value of respecting all farmed animals. But unfortunately, that button doesn't exist. So we have to work with the values that people already have. And I think there's many ways that these can be implemented. On the flip side, we also need to acknowledge that there are many conservative values that run counter to animal advocacy and our goals. And we identified several of them as well in the report. So I wanted to ask both of you, what are some ways that you think conservative values can be harmful to the goals of animal advocacy? For example, Max, you mentioned the culture wars earlier. And how have you been able to navigate this? Are there any strategies that you would recommend?
Yeah, well, as you all point out, DC, I'm coming from a fairly liberal jurisdiction. I think the last election was 94% voting Democrat for president. But that being said, it's still really important, and there's still a diversity of constituents and approaches that we want to take. One thing I like to think of is just how to get the foot in the door here, right? How to make that initial connection. And some of the work where there's a lot of folks who are doing really good work on this throughout the movement. I see Natalie Alwish from Humane Action Pittsburgh, who's really phenomenal at this. And also the folks who have been working on the EATS Act. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, this giant federal bill that's trying to strip all state and local protections around animals, or not all, but so many state and local protections around animals in the food system. And it's just like this outlandish bill. And there's been some really amazing organizing behind how to get more conservative voices speaking up for this, using values of protecting small farms, right? That kind of fits into that family frame. Using the perspective of you know, not overly regulating and being overly heavy-handed from the federal government and infringing on states' rights, things like that. So it's not a surefire solution. Doesn't mean we're going to win these issues, but it's a hell of a lot better than trying it from the traditional frames and only trying it with a left-leaning perspective.
And one of the problems we run into, and you know, I'll go back to the brain studies and the fear aspect. We run into a lot of slippery slope arguments. You know, it's sure it's dogs and cats this year, but it's going to be pigs and chickens next year. And there's this underlying fear that any advancement in improving animal welfare is ultimately going to be, you know, harming the ranchers and the farmers and things like that. And that's kind of tough to overcome. You can tell people, well, that's not what this bill is intended to do, but in the back of their minds, they do feel that it's step by step undermining, you know, their profitability, their operations, and things like that. So that's something we're constantly looking at and trying to reassure people to the extent we can. No, it's only focused on this. You know, if something happens later on, that happens later on, but we're only focused on one particular issue.
Yeah, very, very good. There's definitely a lot of conversation in the movement about the culture war and all of these ways that the values can be essentially utilized against animal advocacy. And they are very often. Excuse me for one moment while I'll take this off. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you sound good.
Sorry about that. My headphones died. I was talking about the ways that conservative values can be harmful to the movement. And you're right, there are many there are people who are opposed to the EATS Act on the Republican side. And there are Republicans who are going to be trying to use bills to protect dogs and cats and things like that. So I do think it often is about framing. Other than framing, I want to ask, what issues do you think are most strategic for the animal advocacy movement to be working with conservatives on? Do we think it's going to be welfare initiatives within factory farming, something to do with alternative proteins, something to do with non-farmed animals, like dogs and cats, like you mentioned, Roland? Are any of these particularly exciting to you and spark a lot of opportunity in your opinion? Either?
Well, there's a lot of things that are exciting, but I think, you know, in looking towards common ground, and Max was talking about this a little bit earlier, if you look at animal, I hate to call it ownership, let's call it animal guardianship. It's pretty evenly dispersed between both conservatives and liberals. And so that's something where you can find common ground and make advances. And when I talk to groups, I talk about the fact when I was growing up, we had a dog that slept in a doghouse outside. It was never in the house. And then when we became a teenager, we had a dog that slept under the kitchen table, but it was still just a pet. And now where do our animals sleep? They sleep in our beds, uh, you know, at least for the most part. And so we're seeing this progression, and I think those are positive steps. And I'm hoping we can take that and move it over into farm animals and wildlife. And a lot of studies are coming out showing the sentience of these animals and how really they can do amazing things that nobody ever stopped to consider. So I see it kind of as you know, what do you want to call it? A gateway, if you will, working with companion animals and then trying to transition slowly into farm animals, into wildlife animals.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I mean, we got to find our foot in the door. The fact of the matter is that most people do not see animals as individuals. And one of the best paths to do that is through the animals that they are in direct contact with, their companion animals, and just elevating that perspective. So, I love what you're saying, Roland. And, I'll tell you, Bjorn, I could see very much a future where conservatives are leaning in on American innovation around plant-based alternatives. Just when you see the business opportunity, when you see essentially the corporate power behind it, it could really excite some decision makers pairing with the businesses. And I think there's many times that we've seen in history where market-based initiatives have outpaced or radically escalated the scale of change. And so, that kind of thing excites me. We can't rest on our laurels here and keep playing defense like we're doing on the EATS Act, which is so important. But I think we need to go on the offense and really sit down and have some of these conversations. And just like drawing from some of my climate advocacy, one of the best ways to open the door with conservative decision makers is just show them that you're not there to fight. You're there for partnership. Start with appreciation. Start with some way to show that, hey, you are there for teamwork. And maybe it's a matter of having a conversation about a couple different things to see what sticks in terms of policy initiatives. But it's a conversation we have to have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We have to have civil conversations, respectful dialogue, and even if we don't necessarily agree on all the issues, we should still be able to discuss that in a manner that allows us to see both sides of the coin. Because sometimes we don't appreciate the other side. If you look at ranchers, for instance, they're just trying to make a living. They're just trying to do things as efficiently as they can. And we might not necessarily agree with the way those animals are raised or whatever, but at least having an understanding of where they're coming from allows us to develop an appreciation, if not an agreement. But that could be a starting point for further dialogue.
I definitely agree with the importance of coming to an understanding with people we might disagree with on these things in order to advance progress. I do want to pull on a couple of the threads that you both mentioned in your answers because I'm really curious. So Max, you're mentioning the basically framing alternative protein as more of a business venture with conservatives. How would you square that initiative alongside bans or prohibitions, to use Roland's word, on cultured meat and on the labeling of plant-based meats that are often led by Republicans or in Republican states? How would you suggest that advocates go about this? Because there certainly is some opposition there. We don't know how many Republicans would agree with this, but some certainly do. So how do you suggest that animal advocates would navigate this?
Yeah, well, these are important questions. And like one big element is just missed opportunity, right? The folks who are banning cultured meat are going to see development in other states, and they're going to see what they're missing out on. And I do see a future where there are businesses that are thriving in other states, in places like Florida and Alabama are like, why are we missing out on this bandwagon? But in terms of the labeling conversation, the folks who are pushing back up against that are doing a really great job of kind of framing around the heavy-handedness of regulation and just how there's really silly things that how big of an overstep it can be. And for those who do believe in small government, it really doesn't make sense to overly regulate. It's not like we regulated away peanut butter, which is by no means aligned with any type of butter that we know. But so to apply that to the plant-based labeling as well seems kind of undue.
And we have to face the reality that most of the people that are against alternative meats, cultured meats, things like that, are the big corporations like JBS, which is one of the largest meat packers in the world. And obviously that's a threat to them. And it would be wonderful if we could somehow get an organization like JBS to start thinking about producing cultured meat. Um, and, um, and that would, I think, open a lot of opportunities. I don't know how you go about doing that. You know, Colorado happens to be a very cattle-rich state, if you will. A lot of our exports are meat. And so you're talking about a tremendous impact to the economy if you're looking at alternatives that take away from the ranchers and the farmers. And that's just always a concern we have to look at. So I do also want to say that when we get back to framing, you know, there was a study done where they had a product that was labeled vegan and nobody was buying it. And they changed the name to healthy and the sales shot up like 57%. Same product, it's just how it was framed.
I know exactly which study you're referring to. I actually
Yeah.
did a write-up on plant-based labeling a couple months back. Yeah, we know the word vegan is not the best word to get non-vegans to buy these products. So words like sustainability, highlighting the taste, highlighting the origin of the food, things like that are just much likely to get people to buy it. So I definitely agree on that end. I think we have time for one more question before we open it up to the audience. I wanted to jump on a thread that Roland mentioned earlier that I'm curious about, which is basically the idea of a slippery slope. So I'm curious about this because our research at Faunalytics from a couple years back has shown that states that have implemented statewide pro-animal laws tend to have local or city or county laws before them that may provide stepping stones to larger state laws. So some advocates are essentially using this strategy, trying to pass pro-animal laws in a city. There's one very salient one happening in Denver that many of us might know of, the slaughterhouse ban bill, that might eventually lead to larger change on a statewide level or potentially a national level, if it comes to that. Do you both agree with this strategy? And have you enacted it in any point in your advocacy work?
I do, you know, in fact, we tried several times to pass on a statewide basis a puppy mill ban, you know, preventing commercially bred dogs from and kittens from coming in and being sold in pet stores. And it failed twice in the legislature, and that was because of agricultural interests. Again, it was, you know, cats and dogs, but then pigs and chickens and whatever. And so we have been going around, and we now have 13 cities or townships that have committed to passing ordinances that would prohibit the sale of dogs and cats in pet stores. And we're continuing on with that. We've got several more in our sites towards the end of the year, and we're hoping we reach a critical mass. And then we can go back to the legislature and say, you know, look, 30%, 40%, whatever of towns and whatever in Colorado agree that this is not right. It's time for the state to act and make it statewide. So sometimes it does help to have that seed planted at the local level and bring it up. So I don't know what your experience has been, Max, but
Yeah, I'll add that, you know, from the perspective of our fur bill, it's really important to have trusted messengers lined up. And like from the applied sense, back when California was passing their fur bill, there was this concern about slippery slope and what's next, wool and leather. And this legislator stood up and spoke, and she spoke so powerfully. She essentially said, listen, I'm not vegan, not vegetarian, I eat meat. Fur is unethical. It is unethical. We need to stop this. And the bill passed, and I think in big part, thanks to that legislator speaking up. So, you know, I think we need allies from many different angles, and we need to have those people lined up ahead of time. You can't go in asking favors last minute. And so this is where, you know, having a trusted messenger, somebody from maybe outside the tribe, validate the concern. And, you know, I had the fun of going to volunteer with Pro Animal Future in Denver with their ballot initiatives. And, you know, they're thinking, and I think they're a very savvy group in terms of research and how to rather than impose their values, work with public values. Their thinking is, let's be upfront with people and tell them about our vision and enroll them in our vision for a kinder, greener world. And, say that, hey, recognize the nuance, and hey, maybe we're not able to be transition away from slaughterhouses overnight, but we do see this as being an important step, and ask people how they feel about it. And that's where, they're doing deep canvassing there, right? So they're not just trying to turn out the vote, but they're actually trying to shift hearts and minds. And I'm really excited that our movement is thinking more about that.
As am I. That's a great stopping point, talking about different hearts and minds, shaping hearts and minds. I'm excited to get into our audience question for you too. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to go in order from when I saw them first. So the first question I see is from Rachel Mason. Hi, Rachel. Do these value differences imply that certain asking policies will be supported by people in different parts of the political spectrum? Or is it more a matter of finding language and framing that works for a particular audience? I guess I'll answer this. It's a little bit more about the study. I believe you asked this during the study portion. I would say both. I would say it's both about finding the right things to support that we think most align with the values, and using the values to frame existing laws, initiatives, and bills. It can be the study was designed to be used in an open-ended way and set a theoretical framework for multiple types of advocacy. So Natalie Alwash asks, as a conservative in the animal welfare movement myself, I often feel that the assumption by many advocates is that there aren't many conservatives in the space, which can create unnecessary division and lead to alienation of those with similar views. So for Roland and Max, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you have any thoughts on how we can bridge this gap?
Some of it, and one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is constituents, and how constituents actually drive the lawmakers. And when a lawmaker gets elected, they're elected by their constituents. And I've had lawmakers on certain bills say to me, I really support this bill, but I have to vote against it because that, it would hurt my chances of getting reelected or whatever. That's not what my constituents wanted. And they were the ones that, elected me, and put it on the ballot and I'll vote for it. So you do have, it can be a problem where you have people that, in principle agree with what you're doing, but publicly they cannot support that. And I don't know if you run into that experience, Max, or not.
Yeah, well, I just want to go back for a second and recognize Rachel, for that great question earlier, and to identify that there's a difference between what we're asking for and how we're asking it. And I think that's a really astute observation, and good to plug into. But yeah, going back to Natalie's question, and I think this is so important, that we really have to be intentional to be inclusive in our movement, right? And yes, I do mean racially inclusive for a movement that is predominantly white. Yes, I do mean generationally inclusive. Yes, I do mean ability inclusive, but I also mean politically inclusive. We need to be thoughtful about surrounding ourselves by people who don't all think the same. And so there are a couple ways that I can see us doing that. And one is naming it, right? Just when you're in a movement, say, hey, we welcome people from all backgrounds, and that includes, whatever political ideology you're part of. I think we have to be clear as a movement that we are warm, and we see differences as a way to make our movement stronger and help us protect animals. The other thing I see being helpful is having roles that are tailored to outreach to conservatives. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about roles that are for Republicans, right? I think people would be a little bit uncomfortable with being targeted and maybe tokenized as like the Republican. But I think there is, so just being a little nuanced here, there is a role for people who want to take the lead on doing outreach to conservative lawmakers, to conservative industries and businesses, doing that type of thinking, and making a space for folks who don't necessarily want to be carrying pickets and handing out leaflets, but maybe people who want to, who may be conservative leaning and would feel better about messaging within the tribe.
I like a lot of what you have to say. I definitely agree. Inclusivity always matters, especially both of who you are and what you believe. I think that tends to make movements stronger. I also want to highlight, Roland, you mentioned sometimes lawmakers don't want to support something that they would support, but their constituents don't support it. And I think this is an opportunity for advocates to use polling and other data to demonstrate to lawmakers that the constituents do support it, if that is what the case may be. Faunalytics, we're doing a project that'll be out next year that's going to aggregate a lot of these polls, a lot of which will be in the United States. And I'm hopeful that the movement will take this more seriously and demonstrate to lawmakers that their constituents do support a lot of this stuff, because they tend to. There's a lot of research showing that people will support in a bill something that they may not do in their actual life, like buy only free range eggs or something like that. They're more likely to believe it should be banned than if they are to only eat free range eggs. So I think that is a big lever that we should be pushing in the movement. So great
Well,
answers both for you. Yeah,
Well,
go
I was
ahead.
going to say one of our missions as Colorado Voters for Animals is to identify and help elect animal-friendly lawmakers, because if you have somebody that's in power already, a lot of those obstacles, if you will, are out of the way. And so we work on that. And we do, this is an election year, we do a ballot buddy, and we ask lawmakers, are they likely to support or oppose particular legislation that we think might be on the horizon? And that gives us some kind of feel for where they're at, and then we can basically endorse them or not endorse them, as the case may be. So I'm kind of getting off target here, but that is one of our goals, is to get animal-friendly people in power to make it a lot easier to pass animal-friendly bills.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. How often in your work are you able to have good faith conversations in which people listen to each other but respectfully disagree versus a trolly, culture war-y type of encounter?
I'd
This
say
is a-
80% of the time. 80% of the time we're able to sit down and just discuss things. And we make a point of that. When I go into the hearings, I go up to the people I know. We have lobbyists, and we know who's going to vote for the bill and who's going to oppose it before the hearing even takes place. I mean, that's the case in about 95% of the cases. But I'll go up to the people I know that oppose and say, I understand you're going to vote against this bill. I know your reasons and whatever. But if there's questions I can answer, please let me know. And we have respectful dialogue. And I've been invited out to some of the ranchers' farms, and I've gone out there and looked at their cattle ranches and things like that, and just kind of shared those experiences. And so we have really good relationships. One of the minority leader, Hugh McKean, who died a couple of years ago, the Republican minority leader, said that Colorado Voters for Animals was the only animal organization they'd work with, because we're open, we're transparent, we're willing to listen, and they may not agree with us on all of the bills or any of the bills, but they're willing to sit down with us and at least talk about them. So it's about relationships.
Love that. Relationships is key. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we like to say that relationships before request, right? You don't go in asking things of people before you have a relationship with them, especially folks from the community, especially folks from outside your tribe, whatever that mean, right? So I love that, Roland. And I'll add, just another really thoughtful question. I'm digging your questions, Rachel. And so, and I'll admit I'm not perfect. I'm sure many of us have gone through an evolution in terms of how to respond to difficult or conversations that feel bad faith. And I'll point out a little anecdote that I'm kind of wrestling with recently, where I was talking to an old family friend about Denver's slaughterhouse ban. And she goes, well, what if people want to have meat? And I kind of got in a huff when she said that. I was like, oh, you're just so missing the point. You're just so missing the point. I was so frustrated. But when we're lobbying, what we like to do is look at every no that we get from a lawmaker as a data point, right? So what is she communicating when she says, what if people want to have meat, right? What is she saying? And to me, when I hear that, what I hear is that she sees meat as a construct and not as something that comes from animals. So maybe there's a way to dive into that more. right? Maybe there's a way to look at the individual that was there, that meat came from, because I know she has an experience with individual animals, right? You know, the point being, I don't even know if that's the right approach, right? I'm not the best, but the point being, look at people's no's, people's feedback as data, and use it as an opening, that there was a chance for dialogue there.
I love that answer. It's a very Faunalytics answer, looking at no's as data points. Love that. Everything is an opportunity to gather data, to gather research, and improve our work. So I agree with that 100%. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, hopefully 2 more. This is from Tracy Ann, who asks, I'm working with rural communities who are being negatively impacted by factory farming. There are values related to indirect outcomes from this industry that appeal to both liberal and conservatives, for example, clean water. Are indirect values consideration for other animal advocacy areas? I'm assuming you mean indirect values and things that are not directly related to the goals of animal advocacy, like animal welfare, but things that overlap in some way. That's my assumption based on your question. So for either of you to, do you think that there are other ways that we could advance animal welfare kind of indirectly, similar to this example she mentions?
Yeah, well, you know, first, let me just applaud you for your work, Tracy Ann. That is really cool that you're doing that. Such an important constituency, so keep it up. I'll say that, you know, yes, just quickly, because I think Roland will have a much better answer on this, but yes, like all the reasons matter, and finding which reason matters most to a decision maker is really useful. That being said, I have seen research that says if you throw too many different reasons of justification at a person, it may seem like it'll embolden the argument, but indeed it's too much for people to process. So you don't want to overwhelm them with too many different reasons. So just keep that in consideration.
And some of it's consumerism, and you know, consumers are the ones that purchase the products. And if we can help educate consumers on making better choices, that will help as well. You know, getting back to the slaughterhouse in Denver, I mean, one of the things they focused on is this slaughterhouse is in one of the most poor communities. You know, they tend to place them in these places where people don't have a lot of choice, and so you have health issues to the community from the slaughterhouses. You have increased crime, which there's tons of studies that have shown that where you have a slaughterhouse operating, there's more crime in the area. And so focusing on those issues can sometimes redirect it from the animal issue, and you're still getting to people and educating them, you know, on the point. And one thing we haven't talked about, and was kind of touched on in the study, is faith as well. And you know, sometimes we will use faith to a very small segment because the environmental issues won't affect them, the animal welfare issues won't affect them. But then if you bring in the faith component, to some people that will resonate when you talk about every major faith has a duty to care for creation and treat animals with dignity and respect. So I don't know if that answered the question, but
About the slaughterhouse ban in Denver, I've been seeing some really great op-eds related to workers' rights, like what you're mentioning, Roland, including from a former slaughterhouse worker. I think this kind of rhetoric and framing, first of all, it's true. Like this is an infringement, so it's not stretching the truth at all. But the framing, I just find very convincing, and I'll send one of the articles into the chat here in case anybody wants to take a look. I think that's another example of like an indirect value.
yeah, that was a very compelling op-ed that person put in. Yeah,
very compelling. Okay, last question for today. We're a tiny bit over, but I think we should ask it. Last question is from Abby. The report covers many common actions in agriculture that are seen as unacceptable by conservatives. However, the report also notes that less than half of conservatives see it as the government's proper place to ensure animal welfare. We've talked about goals and rhetoric that are more popular among conservatives. What are the pros and cons of different tactics and asks? For example, corporate pressure, government, individual action, and community action. I'll give a one study note on this before I hand it off to you two. You're absolutely right, Abby, that conservatives were more likely than liberals to say that corporations should be responsible for animal welfare practices, whereas liberals were more likely to say the government should be responsible for animal welfare practices. One tactic that we could do is to use corporate outreach in conservative areas. We haven't really tested this or anything, but it is a theoretical implication of what that study is. But with that in mind, with those, I want just a more practical answer. I want to hear from you two, from Roland and Max. What do you think of this concept?
Take it away, Max.
Yeah, I'll say it's a really good question, and it's so important that we do think about trade-offs when we are messaging around these things. Something that's big coming up right now is wanting to be better than China, right? That's something that's big that's coming up now in US politics. Wanting to not let China beat us or not let China defeat us. And, it's tough, like on one hand, I love that frame of the US being the best. I do. I really believe that if we set our hearts to something in this country, there's so much we can accomplish. But on the other hand, it's a slippery slope to xenophobia and xenophobia. And we have to be careful of falling into that fervor. So you're right to point out that there are trade-offs. But I think one thing that obviously there's a lot of nuance there, and that there's a lot of different things to evaluate. But I think what this study does a good job of is just identifying different frames for us to be choosing from, and recognizing that different frames, different values are going to resonate with different people, and from there evaluating what the trade-offs may be. And some people may say, yeah, consumers should be buying, this should be a consumer decision. And that's a tough one to handle, because if you're trying to do policy, either corporate or public policy, it kind of takes the onus off of them. So it is, you're right, it is important to evaluate those trade-offs, and I don't have a good answer for you beyond that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't either. I think, Max pretty well covered it. That's just one of those areas that we have to explore and delve into further. But I love the idea of, and maybe something for the future Faunalytics thing is people who buy like one share in a corporation like JBS and go to a shareholder meeting and raise an issue. And obviously it's not going to change, but it's going to raise awareness. And maybe, the butterfly effect, maybe somewhere down the road, it is going to change people's minds and hearts.
That's a great place to end, changing hearts and minds. Thank you both so much for being here. I hope everybody in the audience has learned a little bit, and maybe we can strengthen our advocacy just a little bit more and save a few more animals. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Max.